I'm really glad that you're here. Feel free to stop me if I say something that doesn't make sense or that you have questions about or want to hear more about. The way that I laid this out is I'm kind of trying to situate you all in the current framework that a lot of more conservative people are using, right? And one reason I wanted to do this is because I think that conservative thought does a good job of handling the fact that there are biological differences between men and women. And then from there, what I want to try to do is just pose some questions that we can talk about and sort of give us a groundwork for discussion during dinner. Now, I'm a political theorist, so you may have come to a talk where you deal more with social science or other disciplines, which is great, and I do try to situate it a little bit in that, but really what I'm doing is trying to ask questions about what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a human, what fertility means for our experience of life, and so there's more abstraction involved. But you can tie it back to the social science, I think. So, on that note, for more information, if you want to be able to know the social science well on women and work, I recommend the work of Daniel Snyder and Pat Hastings, Bradford Wilcox, and Daniel Lichter. Now, the first two, they just won an award for a paper on the different ways that people in different classes do childcare and the impact that it has on their children. Daniel Lichter does assortative mating, which basically what that means is who gets married to who, why do they get married to each other, and basically what kind of patterns do we see this set up for people's lives? Brad Wilcox is someone that you might be familiar with because he's done a lot of work on marriage and the family, and that's something the Austin Institute pays special attention to. He's really well known. The reason that I'm pointing you towards him here is that he did some interesting work on what women's preferred distribution of labor is, and it sort of looked like when their children are younger, they would like to work part-time. I also included some women on women and work for you to think about and try to find out more about. Anna Samuel does some work on the question of women and professions, but she's really well known for heading this Institute on Women in Marriage, which is Cana Vox. Elizabeth Corey has a great essay that I recommend you read called No Happy Harmony, and that's about the sort of inherent tensions in being a woman who is a mother and being a woman who seeks to develop other capacities alongside that one and the tensions that arise. Serena Sigaletto is a journalism fellow. She's just got a really important fellowship, but she works for public discourse. She's doing a lot of important work on the question of women, labor, childcare, and then you have Catherine Pakalik, who will be speaking here tomorrow, and she's doing a great project on why women have children. She's also famous for the sort of postcards for Macron, you know, because Macron said, why would an educated woman want to have children? And there's also notable work. You could look at Christina Hoff Sommers or Rachel Liu if you want to. And one thing that's interesting about this, all these women are mothers, right? So they're all trained in different disciplines. But I think 3 of them have a PhD. 1 of them is currently an assistant editor. So they're all kind of balancing these work-life questions. So when you read their work is a live topic. It's important to them. So women in pro-family arguments. Why do I start here? I start here because as someone who is interested in feminism and who's been thinking about the question of women in vocation for a long time, it's not always accepted that the idea that a woman should be a mother is a noble idea or a good idea. And so what I'm trying to do is sort of to focus in on those people who do accept the sort of value of motherhood and the value of maternity. You see a lot of current discussion on, can women have it all? You know, how much has the family suffered because women work outside the home? Tucker Carlson has really kind of been on this, I don't want to say tear, but he's, yeah, you know, sort of like just, well, with women working, then you have the two-income problem, things like that. All these are good points, but what I'm trying to say is that this is a period in time when sort of accepted consensus about women and gender are kind of up in the air, and that's exciting for me as a political theorist. For you, it's probably more pressing because you are making life decisions, whereas I already made those, like, so, but what I'm going to try to do is to use political theory to kind of get into these pro-family arguments. And I mean, it's a spoiler, but I am pro-family. I think being a mother is extremely important. I think of it as being my most important vocation, so I'm not here to tell you don't be a mother or being a mother is bad. What I'm trying to do is to look at the tradition and think about it from the perspective of someone who is a mother, right? So if we look at the Western tradition and we look at Aristotle, one thing that I see recurring in contemporary discussions about women, especially in more conservative corners, is this idea of the woman as subordinate to the male as the father, and the oikos as being her domain, and that being appropriate by nature. So we'll look at that. It's subordinate, but not in the way that maybe, we have this attachment to equality and we think anytime we hear subordinate, it's bad. I mean, the argument here would be that it's under the leadership of someone else, but it is essential to the functioning of the whole ultimately being the political community. Another sort of avenue that I see opening up in conservative discourse, it's related, but I think it's different in its claim, which is that women and men are different from one another, and their roles are separate but equal. Tocqueville is someone who does this, and Chesterton has some important writings on this, Wendell Berry, if you're interested in more. The last point that I see coming out is not something that you find in the canon as much as I think you see it in discourse now, which is the question of women's fertility and what our purpose is. And so here I use some more contemporary thinkers to look at the question of fertility and what that means for women as embodied humans. Okay, so entering the conversation. I'm entering this complex conversation. I'm indebted to a lot of different kinds of thinkers. I want to express that I have a high regard for previous and current work on the topic. I have a high regard for the multitude of ways women choose to address these tensions. And what I'm really offering or trying to offer here is a perspective from political theory to sort of say, what does it mean to be a woman and a human? I do, and I mean, I want to in some circles it would be bad. I do think that canonically speaking, philosophers or political theorists have thought of the default human as a man. And what I'm trying to say is, okay, what would it mean if we brought into this discussion that the default human is not only the human that reproduces like a man? And what would that mean? So the tension, of course, for me then, and for the whole canon generally, is the tension between difference and sameness. The tension between the fact that on the one hand, we know, especially if we come from a Christian anthropology, that there's equality and dignity between the man and the woman. But on the other hand, we see that there are these obvious differences. And these differences have claims on us and give us different responsibilities in some cases. So how do you handle that tension? There's the basic gist of where I want to take things is, and here I'm foregrounding sort of what my thoughts are before I get into the canon more precisely. I'm concerned that when it comes to the question of women and work, while progressives tend to just ignore women's biology and the fact that we can get pregnant, I think that conservatives tend to just be like, what you can do is get pregnant. And that's another thing you want to avoid. I want to talk about why. I also, I think that this is knowingly or unknowingly sort of trading on this industrial era model of the home and the division of labor in the home. I think motherhood is going to require a lot of give and take from women. So, you know, there are times where I'm not going to go to a conference because a child is sick, or I'm leaving the conference early because my child misses me. There are going to be things that will be different. I was on bed rest with my last child, so I had to sort of tap out of work. I had prepared it to where a TA could take over, but I was on bed rest for about 2 or 3 weeks and then had to deliver early. So I know that I have experienced that being a mother alongside being other things requires give and take from me. What I want to suggest is that it also requires give and take from men, our partners, or not our partners, our bosses or colleagues or whatever. Businesses, degree programs, and people who hire. You know, you hear just before we head into this, if you are a woman who leaves the workforce to raise your children, a lot of times you have trouble with re-entry because everyone else has been building their resume, and people say, well, what were you doing during this time? Well, I was taking care of my kids. That's really important, but it's hard to get someone to take a chance on you. So give and take all around is kind of what I'm envisioning here. Okay, so subordinate part of the whole. Here I'm looking at what Aristotle has to tell us about women, and I'm using Aristotle. I love Aristotle. I think of him as being an important figure in the Civic Republican tradition, maybe like the founding figure, right? And so in a lot of ways, if you want to talk about what it means to be a human and what it means to be a free human, it's Aristotle who you need to look at. You probably know enough about Aristotle to have a basic gist of his argument that the human is happy when they are flourishing. Okay, what the goal of the human is eudaimonia, and what it turns out that means happiness. What it turns out this happiness is human flourishing. The human at using all their capabilities as best they can, in the ways that they can. I tell my students at Texas State, you guys have probably seen, well, maybe you haven't, but like, you know, if you're like in front of a car dealership and you see those wavy things, you know, and they have the air under them, Okay, so I always think of Aristotle as like, you know, if you don't have your virtues and you're not getting certain capabilities actualized, then you're like this, right? But if you're like, you know, if things are going well, then you're like the human like this, okay? And I really think that's a good way to think of it. So for him, being happy and kind of finding a sort of fulfillment as a human is finding fulfillment in the capacities that we have. And there's lots of things that are part of that capacity. You have speech, you have thought, relationships, politics, all sorts of things. Practical reasoning is an important component of being able to find that happiness. And practical reasoning is a sort of judgment about particulars. Okay, it's a judgment about particulars. The person who has a sound sort of practical reason is able to sort of combine an idea of what the good is with individual decisions that they make. I think that's the best way to put it. You're able to think about an end, but to get to that end, to understand what choices to make to get to that end. And that end is living well as opposed to just living. I mean, an example might be education. You know, am I going to just show up at school and, you know, get by? Or am I going to see this as a time to improve myself intellectually and spiritually, make this distinction? But whatever end you identify, you're going to be making individual choices that will further that end or take you further away from it. Practical wisdom is being able to reason in a way where you're choosing between alternatives that life gives you, okay? And you're able to make these choices in light of what is fitting, okay, what is good for humans broadly, but you also particularly as a human. And someone who is able to be wise in this way is able to make these choices in a way that incorporates emotion and appetite, but is not led by it, okay? And this is important. So for Aristotle, doing all of this and doing it well is what it means to be fully sort of human, and in that sense, fully free. Now, very famously, he thinks that only some people can have or experience this kind of freedom. There's a lot of debate about whether he thinks this is good, whether he thinks this is bad, whether he thinks this is just something distinctive to Greek society. But one person that he sort of thinks can only participate in this sort of human excellence in a diminished way is the woman, okay? Because he says that the woman's reason lacks authority. And there's two ways that you can interpret this. You can either interpret this to mean that he thinks that women aren't listened to, so they don't have authority because the political community won't recognize them. The more common way to interpret it, and the way that I think is persuasive, is that Aristotle thinks that women can't be in control of their emotions enough to reason clearly. And so he says, you know, the natural slave is the person who can't make judgments at all. They can't deliberate at all. The woman is not like that. She can deliberate, but she doesn't have the authoritative deliberation of the man, okay? From here, he then goes on to say that you can have a woman develop different moral virtues, but she will develop them as a woman, okay? And that what that means will be different, and that it will exist in light of her duty, basically her role. So an example would be to say, he says in politics, a woman and a man's moderation are not the same. Their courage is not the same. their justice is not the same. The male has what he calls ruling courage or ruling moderation, and the woman has assisting courage or assisting moderation. So they're species of the same virtue, but with with an eye toward a different end. You have then this sort of question, okay, well, what is the end of the woman? So on the one hand, you have Aristotle saying that our reason is not authoritative, and that there's a certain sort of inferiority or lack in the way that we exercise this human capacity. But he also brings it back to roles, right? Because you saw that when he talks about the different virtues and how they're developed, he says they're sort of developed in the context of a role. So what is the woman's role? For him, in the politics, the woman's role is in the household, in the oikos. And this is really important for him. And he's not saying that it's not, he's not saying, oh, you should stay in the kitchen barefoot and pregnant. What he thinks of is that sort of kitchen, that home is sort of the early part or the most essential part of making humans that are able to be citizens or to be directed toward the good of the polis. So even though it's not the highest end, it's a really important end. And at one point in the politics, he actually says that, okay, let's sort of go through this slowly. Since any household is a part of a city, and these are parts of a household, and since the virtue of the part must look to the virtue of the whole, okay, so since the oikos is the part he's talking about here, the home, looks to the virtue of the whole, which is the city. The education of children and women must be undertaken with an eye to the regime. That's the whole, right? At least so it must be if having children and women who are serious makes a difference to having a serious city. When Aristotle says serious, this is one of the best praises he can use. He doesn't mean serious like important. What he means is serious like a serious human, a real human, someone who's really sort of functioning at the highest level that they can in their position. And so the spoudaia is the wise woman, the serious woman. And so in the politics, he does refer to women as having this capacity. The difference is that they have the capacity in the context of the role. Interestingly, though, while he's at pains to say that the household and the polis are different and one is ordered to the other, serious judgment or virtuous judgment is necessary for the functioning of both, and the particular virtue he identifies is prudence in both cases. You need prudence to be the person who runs the oikos, and you need prudence to be the person who runs the city. And in both cases, he identifies particularly the case of education. For him, the lawmaker's laws educate. And for him, the woman in the house educates. Prudence is used in both cases. There's a scholar, H.L. Levy, who does an interesting job where he looks at other texts, he looks at the history of animals, and he compares it to parts of the politics. And what he ends up sort of showing is that for Aristotle, in the history of animals, I guess let's go through this slowly. Women in the history of animals have a form that is inferior to the male. Okay, Aquinas talks about this a bit too. It's this idea of this form that doesn't develop all the way. And And this means certain things, and one of them means that there's a sort of deficiency in female courage for him. This is what he says in The History of Animals. But he says that women are more suited to prudence, actually, in the history of animals. They're more suited to proper judgment. And he actually goes so far as to sort of name a bunch of intellectual characteristics that women are better at. Rational learning, the rearing of the young, memory. They're more scheming than men, though. Scheming is not necessarily bad for politics, though. And so where Levy sort of takes you is to say, okay, if you have these superior intellectual characteristics and you're trusting the woman to build the citizen with an eye to the regime, she has a lot of capacity. And she has the exact capacities that Aristotle says make a person serious. And not just make a person serious, but make them virtuous and able to flourish, okay? He goes so far as to compare, Levy says, all the characteristics of the woman are the characteristics of the lawgiver. So then the question becomes, if women can be serious, if women can be prudent, if prudence is the art of a lawmaker and the art of the homemaker, and here I'm sort of highlighting education, laws, educative, the household's educative, then there's a tension, because women are supposed to be lacking authority, we're supposed to be deficient in certain ways, but then we have basically essential capacities that are very sophisticated. And that are obviously very sophisticated in its own account. So then the question is, what's stopping the sort of ability to make prudential judgments about education from translating into the political community? That's one tension. The other tension I think you see is that, and this I think would matter more for us than for Aristotle, is if a woman is a human, and human flourishing involves the sort of experience and practice of different capabilities. If you're telling the woman, sorry, those excellences or capabilities aren't for you, in a way you're telling them they're not going to be free in the same way that humans, identified as male humans, are. Okay, and for Aristotle, that's fine. I think for us, we have a harder time with that. Okay, and the next sort of point I want to get to is this idea of separate but equal. Okay, and I want to be at pains to say I think men and women are different in a lot of ways. I think that biological differences exist. It is important to say that some of the most recent neuroscience research shows that there's not really a male and female brain in the last year or so. This was an earlier sort of contentious finding. Men have certain types of neurological activity, women have certain type of neurological activity, and they have different structures. More recent research is starting to show that's not the case. This is an open question, but it's something to put on the table. Here I'm using Tocqueville, okay? And I start with Tocqueville because he's really beautiful. He is a beautiful writer. And if you ever get a chance, you need to read Democracy in America section on women, because it's gorgeous. It's just gorgeous. He talks about the woman, the American woman, who's superior to the European woman, but she's superior because she accepts her nature. And she is educated to the fullest extent possible. She has great judgment, she has great taste, she has great knowledge, but it's all for an eye toward being a good companion to her husband and being a mother to her children, and then in this way sort of being a mother to the country, or mother to the republic. And he has a lot of really beautiful passages. There's one in particular, I think, where he talks about the woman who's educated in this way, the American woman, submits herself joyfully to the yoke of her husband, and doesn't regard it as a yoke at all. But he says that in doing so, she actually becomes more powerful than the husband and then men generally, because she has a sort of moral authority that elevates her. And in this way, the American woman is very powerful. So this quote kind of encapsulates it. And you see in it a sort of echoing of Aristotle. I'll just read it out loud. Thus, the Americans do not believe that man and woman have the duty or the right to do the same things, but they show the same respect for the role of each one of them, and they consider them as beings whose value is equal. Although their destinies differ, they do not give the courage of the woman the same form or the same use as that of the man, but they never doubt her courage. And if they consider that the man and his companion should not always use their intelligence and their reason in the same way, they judge, as least, that the reason of the one is as certain as that of the other, and her intelligence as clear. So you see the echoes of Aristotle, right? But then you see the elevation to equality, right? And this is why I said separate but equal, right? For Aristotle, the woman is sort of inferior, subordinate, still important. For Tocqueville, he's talking about these differences, and so the virtues will be different in each, and the roles different in each, but the roles are equal. They're both essential. And actually, he ends up saying that the role of the American woman is one in which she has more authority, because she has a moral authority that exists. It guides politics without being in politics. The Americans, he says, sort of use natural differences by accepting them, and in this case, ennobling them, by not fighting against what he sees as the natural difference between men and women, but accepting it and building society around it. They elevate the woman and recognize her as being great, but as having a greatness that is different from man. And while she's equal to man, he says it is necessary that she be commanded by him. Yes.
Contrast Tocqueville's position. What Aristotle says about equality, when talking about like how people who are the same in certain things, it's just that they should be equal, but where they're different, it's just that they should be different. So like Aristotle's idea of equality with this.
Good. Okay, so you're tracking on a really important point here. One thing that Tocqueville does is there's a part of Democracy in America where he talks about the incarnation. And he says what the incarnation accomplishes is this sort of recognition of human equality that the pagans don't have. And so what that does is it changes what justice means. Once you have, for Tocqueville, and here I'm just speaking like a Tocquevillian, for Tocqueville, once you have the incarnation, this is God becoming man, okay? And this means that equality, moral, spiritual, human equality is important in a way that makes democracy, if it's running well, more just. You can't have these hierarchies of aristocracy that are based on this idea that some people are created better than others. Because, once Christ is, God becoming man and then God becoming a really poor man, it kind of explodes all of that for Tocqueville. For Aristotle, nature shows us that hierarchy is just. For Tocqueville, nature in Tocqueville is very difficult, but he thinks the incarnation shows us philosophically and morally that there's something to the status of humans as moral beings that makes more of an equal plane. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so it would be like equal in dignity, but not necessarily like equal in functions or dispositions or
Right.
capacities.
Yes. Whereas for Aristotle, having the equality in the difference of the roles, not important. That's not a matter of justice. It's not true, and it's not a part of justice. You don't say, oh man, the polis is unjust because women, lack authority or something. That wouldn't happen. But by the time you get to Tocqueville, it does. It's a different understanding of justice. G.K. Chesterton has some interesting stuff. He's always a joy to read, right? He talks about women and he says, woman is like the fire. Okay, she illuminates and she ventilates. But to remain a flame, what does she have to do? You have to protect her. Okay, she's a fire, she's important, she's lighting things up, she's giving heat. But if the wind comes, the cold comes, she's just gonna. Okay, so what you have to do is you have to protect her from the cruelty of competitive or bureaucratic toil. Okay, you have to protect that flame. It's a life-giving flame. And he's here, he actually goes on then to elaborate on what he's saying in terms of labor. And he says, look, a woman needs to be a storyteller because storytelling is an essential part of education, and women have to educate. They're young. This is a part of what's so important about them. But you don't want her to be too good of a storyteller. He says, the woman should not seek out the startling revelations or the wildest winds of thought, okay, but instead should repeat stories with the acuity of a first-class cook, okay, like a cook who's following a recipe, who has good judgment, but not wandering away from the recipe. The virtuous woman, then, shouldn't have a trade. She shouldn't try to become the master of a trade or a skill. She should be able to have a lot of different hobbies, different kinds of things that she can do. And he calls this developing her second best. Okay, developing her second best. And this is what he says has been meant by keeping women in the household, keeping them secluded. It's not to hurt them, but to protect them, to protect that fire. So then, I'm kind of going to raise the question again that I raised earlier, which is if they have the capacity, if you tie capacity to excellence, what does this mean about the sequestering, right? Nobody's going to tell G.K. Chesterton, hey, don't work on your storytelling, just be protected in the home. And I think we have to ask, well, why? On the other hand, though, we have to confront, and this is where I'm ending up, biological difference. Okay, women and men are different, and you can say, like, they're obviously different. Some men are gonna, not many that men are gonna be weaker than me, but some might. Generally, men are stronger than women. Generally, they're bigger than women. Generally, men go into STEM fields, and women, even when they are empowered to go into STEM, seem statistically to go into other types of work. So biological difference is a thing, and here I'm really focusing on pregnancy, on reproduction, which is the most obvious biological difference. And what I want to do is look at the work of a prominent feminist, Soren Reeder, who talks about motherhood. And one reason I picked her is because she's kind of provocative, but another reason I picked her is because she's like trafficking on Aristotle. And I'll show you how. Basically what she wants to say is that motherhood is a kind of a relationship that does not exist in any other form. It is its own thing. It's sort of the human relationship par excellence because it creates another person. Okay, motherhood creates another person. Just talking about procreation, gestation, birth, care. He says you see this in other relationships, in friendships, teaching, coaching, fathering, but for the mother, when she has her child and she raises him from his babyhood until all the other stages of his life, she is so deeply and intimately involved in his development as a human. You don't really see that in any other kind of relationship. Now, if you study Aristotle has the four causes, efficient, material, formal, final. Four causes. Everything has four causes. Okay, and so what she does here is she takes motherhood and looks at it in this sort of four causes language. You have efficient causal creation. That's you have sex. You have material, physical, and biological creation. You have formal social creation, okay, early years socialization, and then the final cause, the creation of the person, the summoning of the into the full human being, okay, in the education of the child. And what she says is when you become a mother, you're expected to be at least open to doing all of these things. I'm going to get in here to some work I'm doing with a colleague, Catherine Sims Cooper, on what this means, what this kind of experience of motherhood means for our fertility, particularly understood as abortion, which is the idea of abortion nowadays. You see it expressed as kind of a necessary step for women. If they want to be free, if they want to have different kinds of opportunities and experiences, they have to have the option of terminating this sort of all-consuming experience of motherhood. And they can have it when they want it, and they shouldn't have it when it's not useful or appropriate of a time. Now, what Catherine and I are sort of playing with is this idea that the mother should have control over the life and death of their offspring in utero is the same sort of right that is expressed by the tyrant. Okay, the father, the pater familias, which can have positive connotations, but ultimately it had the connotation, the legal connotation, that you had rights over the life of the child, right? And so abortion basically gives you, I think now, at this point in our ethical development, in our discussion of it, the right of life and death over your offspring as a woman. And it's what it means for you to be free. To be human, to be free, to develop all of these capacities, you have to be able to terminate the pregnancy because it's such an intrusive relationship, such an all-consuming relationship. It interferes with these developments. You should only have it when you choose to have it. We suggest that pregnancy, Reader says this, and we agree, is the end game for feminist politics. Okay, when feminists are dealing with equality, what do they always come up against? Well, I'm a feminist. What do I always come up against? The fact that when I was having my baby, I was on bed rest, not my husband. He made the baby too. He wants to help, but him going on bed rest is not going to do anything, okay? Whose life was in danger and had to get a C-section? Me, not him, okay? And that's fine. Like, I don't hold that against him. But you can see why, when it gets down to asking questions about women and women's role, pregnancy is always the thing that kind of comes in then pregnancy and sort of life and death that can come along with that, and motherhood, which is sort of the fruit of this experience. So what we think is, if feminism is trying to not be a mother, or trying to control when you're a mother and when you're not, through this sort of potential use of absolute power, then what that means is that in order to be free, what you're saying is you need to be able to dominate. Okay, you need to be able to dominate someone else. And this is something that we have really tried to get away from. The idea that to be a full human, you have to make someone else your slave. It's essential to what it means to be self-directing, right? A self-directing person doesn't try to have slaves. A self-directing person tries to direct themselves, right, and not use coercion and death to bend other people to their will. So, just to wrap it up, as things go on, and as you'll see the discussion of women continue to develop, where I think it's tracking is women, when we talk about abortion, we're not so much questioning anymore whether the fetus is human or not. That discussion is sort of over. And I think you see the fact that that discussion's over in partial birth abortion. Nobody is going to say that partial birth abortion is the abortion of a non-human, because everybody can see by the time you get that late in gestation, it's obviously this viable thing. But so that's why I think you're going to see feminism, insofar as its progressive trend, is an acceptance of that necessity. But what I want to suggest is that that doesn't actually end biological difference. Okay? That you can't unconceive what you conceived. All you're doing is terminating the evidence of the difference inside yourself, right? It's not disclosing to the world. So it's like a Band-Aid response to biological difference. What I'm trying to say is, what would it be to take seriously this idea that a woman's fertility is something that an equal human has, right? An equal human can get pregnant. An equal human can be a mother. What should society look like in light of that? And let me skip to this because it makes more sense. I think that there are two roles that you see in conservative discourse and progressive discourse. The first role is to say that the woman is all about her fertility, okay, all about her motherhood. The second role is to sort of say that woman has to be free of her fertility, free of her motherhood, to be human. And I feel like these are two poles, right, that we're sort of caught between. On the conservative side, my little critique would be that when we talk about men and we talk about reproduction, we don't tend to reduce them to it. This is crass. I'm really sorry to say this, but I'm going to put it on the table, which is like, if a man is sexually aroused, he's able to use prudence to determine whether or not this biological function means that they should have sex, right? Not every instance of arousal is an instance of it's time for sex. There's a lot more to men, and there's a lot more to them than the sort of normal biological function, and their judgment is involved in that, right? Another thing to sort of ask is, if you think of a social role, what's a typical social role that conservatives have for men? The soldier, okay? And you can see that makes sense. Okay, if men are strong, if they have throughout history been able to defend the country, defend their families through physical force, through different types of courage and bravery and running into the face of death. This is really important. In a lot of ways, maybe distinctly male. But does that mean that every man is always and everywhere a soldier? Is that how we relate to every man? And so the last thing that I want to say, which is a part of this concluding portion, is that a lot of this goes back to a problem in how we think of women's fertility. There was a little article that came out from a woman who used to work at the university in Steubenville, where she said, her name's Rebecca Braden-Weiss, she said that we make the mistake of thinking of women's fertility in the Heideggerian terms of standing reserve. Okay, what is standing reserve? Heidegger defines it as that which is ordered to stand by, to be immediately on hand, indeed to stand there, just so it may be on call for a further ordering. And an example of this is water, rushing water that can activate a mill or activate some more sort of technological thing. Okay? You want the rushing water, you want to control it, to use it for the ends you identify as being socially useful. But you want it to come when you call it. Okay? You want it to be there at hand. Okay? What happens with standing reserves, when standing reserve makes itself known, it's seen as intrusive. If it intrudes onto the order that's been set out for it. And what Braden-Weiss says is that that's how we think of fertility. Where fertility is uninvited, it causes scandal, okay? Especially in a technologically ordered society. So if we can change our relationship to women's fertility, we might be able to resolve some of these tensions I brought up earlier in the sort of equal dignity of women and the equal capacity of women and our biology and our social roles. You know, educating the next generation of people is really important. And I suggest that we're still sort of locked into this frame where if we accept the importance of women's role as mothers, we think that the male form is higher or more human. I don't think we've broken out of that yet. So that's kind of where I'll end.